No matter how many times I've read the stories of the Torah, week after week, year after year, there is often a verse or even a word, the atmosphere, or a sense of something that I've missed, that escaped my notice in past, more careless readings. Last week, as I read through the parasha that concludes the book of Genesis, the death of Jacob, the reconciliation of the brothers with Joseph, I realized that these chapters don't just tie up the ends and make things whole and good, like any well-written novel that ends with something transformational or redemptive, but that there are verses that hint at the darkness of something to come, an uneasiness, the suggestion that all is not right, the beginnings of a dysfunction in the regime. Why are Joseph's brothers so fearful that Joseph will still bear them enmity and will wreak revenge on them? Why do they lie and send a third party to Joseph to instruct him to forgive the brothers? Why does Joseph tell them that while they intended to do him harm, God intended it for good, to keep them alive as a people? Why does he tell them not to be afraid, that he will provide for them and their little ones? Was it only the case that Jacob's sons were afraid of their powerful brother, afraid of what he would do to them once their father Jacob was dead? And why, when Joseph instructed his bones to be brought up from Egypt and taken to the land of Israel, was his body not carried up and buried there straight away, as his father had been? Was there something else happening around them that made them feel troubled and vulnerable? Had the dark clouds of a new regime started to gather, removing the comfort and certainty of being settled and welcome in Egypt? That sense that something had changed, a feeling of dread, is realized in the opening chapter of Exodus, this week's parasha. The descendants of Jacob multiply and are prolific. Vatimale haaretz otam. The land is filled with them. A new king arises over Egypt. The memory of Joseph and past pharaohs are lost in time. The new king articulates his fear of Israel's numbers, the need to deal shrewdly with them in case they join with his enemies and go to war against them. He does not send in immigration or customs officials to investigate them or to deport them, but sets taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. There is a ruthless callousness in his prejudice and discrimination against this small minority in his country, and life becomes bitter for the Israelite people as their lives are crushed by hard labor. The opening verses of Shemot, of Exodus, echo the opening verses of Bereshit, Genesis, the creation narrative. Just as humankind is commanded to be fruitful and multiply in Genesis, so in Exodus we learn that the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased greatly, so that the land was filled with them. The Torah is making the point that this beginning of Exodus is a new creation. The family of Israel will form itself into a nation, but creation that ends with God's satisfaction and that things are very good is different here. In Egypt, there is oppression, taskmasters who crush the Israelite spirits with forced labor. In reading this section, my eye caught a particular Hebrew word, vayakutsu, translated as they dreaded. I was careless in my reading because I assumed that it was the Israelites who dreaded the Egyptians. Who would not have feared a regime that imposed harsh labor and eventually instructed the Hebrew midwives to drown all male infants and keep alive only the female babies? The life of these slaves, the language that's used, reminds us of the hard labor endured by concentration camp survivors and victims, quarrying, construction, digging, demolishing, mining and tunneling, the tasks that were designed to annihilate workers through endless days of harsh and bitter labor, with scarcely enough food to keep them alive. And the separation of babies from their parents has a more immediate and fearful reminder of children being separated from their parents under a controversial immigration enforcement strategy. In assuming that the dread belonged to the Israelites and referred to their fear, I misread the verse, because what it actually says is this: but the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that they began to dread the Israelites. So it was not the Israelites who dreaded and feared the Egyptians, but the other way round. And this is the word vayakutsu, which I think is connected to the word kots, meaning thorn, that caught my eye and made me assume that it must refer to the fear and dread of the Israelites for their taskmasters. Vayakutsu made me question its translation. They dreaded. The word in my concordance is translated with even greater strength as to feel a loathing, an abhorrence, a sickening dread. It's a word that's used only 9 times in Tanakh in a number of different contexts. In Genesis 27, Rebekah says to her husband Isaac, "Katzti v'chayai," I abhor, or perhaps I am sickened by my life because of the daughters of the Hittites. She expresses her worry that Jacob, who has just deceived his father and done his brother Esau out of the blessing reserved for the eldest son, will marry one of the daughters of the land. And this is the reason, she says, for sending him away. In Numbers, the Israelites complained to Moses about the manna, the special food that they're given to eat, saying they loathed the miserable food. V'nafshenu katsa balechem haklokel. In other contexts, it's God expressing divine abhorrence of idolatrous and immoral practices. But to return to our verse, as I look again at the words, I see that its translation is perhaps not so straightforward, because the subjects of the verbs are not necessarily made clear. They're not there. But the more they were oppressed, presumably the Israelites, the more they increased and spread out, so that they came to dread the Israelites. This is one reading. The Egyptians abhor and are sickened and dread the Israelites, whom they've turned into their slaves. But this word, vayakutsu, which has no clear subject, could also refer to the Israelites who are frightened and feel dread among themselves. It's a forced reading, but it connects us to the dread and uncertainty of our own times and the events that have taken place this week in Minnesota, elsewhere in the United States, and in the world. Whatever our hope for the future, whatever our faith in the goodness of humanity, I am sure I am not alone in feeling a sense of dread and in having to summon courage and strength to stand up just as the midwives stood up and resisted the harsh decrees of Pharaoh. It is their actions, the actions of Moses' mother, sister, and the daughter of Pharaoh, all of whom feature in this week's parashah and save the life of one small baby. It is their actions from which we must derive our inspiration and our willingness to act and speak when we see that things are not right. Through their actions, the liberator of the Israelite slaves was rescued. Let us find the courage, strength, and faith to stand up for righteousness, for goodness, and truth. Amen.